Hello and welcome to Fishy Work, episode 3, what happens when people move and refuse. In Fishy Work thus far, we've spoken more broadly about why conditions at sea can be so bad, including organised attempts to improve the working lives of fish workers. And we've also spoken about the management of the fish supply chain, including how NGOs have worked with companies, especially with the aim of removing forced labour from their business networks. In this episode, we want to centre on the fish workers, especially migrant workers, including looking into how they migrate and, crucially, what their migration means in social, political and economic terms. And we have two amazing researchers to help us understand this. Siddharth Chakravarty, a PhD researcher at Queen Mary University of London, and Andrew Lee, assistant professor at the Sanford School of Social and Family Dynamics, Arizona State University. And as always, stick around after the interview for a regular catch-up with Aline Kadvak, our very own Not on the Net, who'll give us her expert take on the discussion. All right, so welcome to Fishy Work. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Siddharth, how's London treating you today?
Hi, Andrew. Hi, Ian. London's great. We had a couple of beautiful sunny days as I arrived. I just got back from India to London a couple of days ago. And today's a rainy day, typical of London. But it's warmer and it's nice to be here.
You've had your 2 sunny days. That's the end of summer in London. And anyway, you, Andrew, how are things for you? How's Arizona?
It's going well. The summertime feels like an oven. So we're getting to our sunny season, but they say that Arizona is better than other parts of the world because you can't shovel sunshine. So it's pros and cons.
Great. So in this episode, we're going to be focusing on the migration of Vietnamese fish workers who work in Taiwanese vessels and often port in Trinidad. That's one of the case studies that Andrew's going to be talking about. And also then the internal migration of workers in India, particularly those who move from forested areas in the north to Goa on the western coast. And these are two quite different contexts. And because of that, and because I think most listeners might not be familiar with that, I think we need a fair amount of details about how such a labour migration takes place before, as we move on in the discussion, we can talk about the implications of this migration. So let's start with the case of the Indian workers, if that's okay. Siddharth, how does their internal migration happen, both maybe more generally and the case that we're going to talk about today, which I know from reading your paper?
So the case that we are talking about is not an international fishery. It's Indian boats fishing in Indian waters, and the labor force is also Indian. So unlike a transnational setting, which Andrew works with, this is really an internal migration. It's recorded, the migration of fish workers, and that kind of migration follows migration generally, which is not specific to fishing. So you have people from the east coast of India migrating to the south and the west coast of India, which follows other forms of construction workers, people moving for urban, informal work, construction, tourism, some of those sectors. And as India's fishery has developed in the post-independence period, particularly from the 1960s and 70s onwards, it has been accompanied by a demand for labor that can work on bigger boats, now almost to an industrial size and scale. And this workforce moves to work on these boats. And a lot of them initially and generally still come from former fishing communities. So, they typically have a small boat, be involved in a community-based fishing activity, mostly on the east coast of India. And then they move to the west coast and work as workers in waged relations on these bigger boats. And specific to the paper that's just come out, it's the migration of people from the central Indian region. So from a geography and from a community that's really not been connected to the sea and has recently, in the last 10, 12 years, begun to move to find work in fishing on the west coast. So that's the kind of trend of migration where you have people moving mainly to the west coast, which is the bulk of the industrial fishery in India as well. And they move informally. It's not really a structured migration with brokers or agencies involved. It's usually people who've been working in the fishery for a long time, who have got close to the vessel owners. They'd go home, to their villages, source 6, 7, 10 people to travel with them in the new fishing season. These men will typically be on the boat for about 10 months of the year, and then they'll return for a couple of months when there's a closure to the fishing season, and then they'll return maybe with more workers if the owner's expanding their operations or they've been successful. So it's sort of mediated within the community.
May I just ask one further question, because the case that we're going to be talking about, you mentioned they're not traditional fish workers, right? So this is a new migration flow. So I'm wondering how that came about.
Yes, so this paper that we've written essentially began with the COVID-19 lockdown, which now is 4 years ago. And I used to be involved in relief and repatriation work when the COVID lockdown was announced in India. And that's kind of the first time in the place where I was staying, which was in Goa, that we saw people from the indigenous community in quite significant numbers in a state that is not a very big state. So it's Goa, which is just a 100-kilometer coastline, but there were about 18,000 indigenous people working in that fishery. And because of the COVID lockdown, there were multiple hurdles in them getting back home, crossing borders. And so it became even more evident that it's not a straightforward movement. It doesn't follow historical trends. The connection between home regions and work regions isn't as established. And so the observation then has led us, of course, to look at what might be the reasons why people come here, what are the conditions under which they come. And in discussing from the paper, a few of the things that we've been thinking about recently is, one, what fishery are they working in? And so they work in what is a pelagic fishery, which is more surface dwelling fish, which requires a very large workforce. It's quite manual, up to 40 people can be required on a boat. And so that's one of the reasons. The second reason is that it works in a setting that is quite unique in the sense it's very sensitive to climate impacts. And so some of the strategies of the boat owners are to have low-cost labor as a way to absorb losses and profits through the years. And that could be one of the driving reasons. The third thing, of course, which we try to do is to look at what's happening in the home regions. And the area where the people come from have historically seen displacement through colonial extraction and their absorption as labor into coal mines, into the tea plantations, as indentured workers in Fiji and, the Caribbean. And so this seems to be another of that wave of expulsion of people moving out due to a range of conditions and finding work in the fishing industry. So we try to look at it as multiple factors, both historical and contemporary, but also in relation to ecology and capital processes at sea that drive and structure why people move and what working conditions they find themselves in.
Fascinating. And we're going to come back and explore that particular case more. And I also want to ask a little bit more about methods in a short while as well. I mean, you've touched on it a little bit. But let's turn to the case that you're speaking about, Andrew. How does their labour migration happen? The case of Vietnamese workers who are on Taiwanese boats and, as you write about in the paper that I've read, end up in Trinidad.
Yeah, so this type of migration, I love the point of comparison, comparing to Siddharth's case, where it's internal migration. My case is inherently external migration. So leaving the borders of Vietnam, going to Taiwan and then Trinidad. So to begin, the story that I tell in my research is thinking about Vietnam and its centrally planned economy in 1986. During that time, the socialist system, just wasn't working. And so as the Vietnamese government moved to free up the economy, it in effect freed up its citizens to migrate. So during this time, in the 90s, the Vietnamese government saw remittances as a way to drive economic growth in rural communities and also solve economic underemployment in these areas too. So you had in the 90s, the Vietnamese state really going forward and promoting export labor, promoting Vietnamese migrants to work abroad. And then around the same time, you had a phenomenon in Taiwan where you had the Taiwanese economy being very strong, but having an aging population and a young population that was just not that all interested in manual labor, in hand and feet labor. And this is especially true in the fishing sector. So, Taiwan has one of the largest fishing fleets in the world, but they lack the manpower to man these ships. So, as Vietnam and Taiwan relations naturalized, more and more Vietnamese began to work in Taiwan and on these Taiwanese fishing vessels, especially this far shore fishing. So, the story continues after these migrants sign their contracts, they work abroad. These offshore fishing vessels are just notorious. They're notorious for being one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. There's a certain lawlessness or unregulation on board these ships, a lot of despotic power from these fishing captains. And then these migrants face the full force of this abuse when they're at sea. Now, the story ends for a lot of migrant Vietnamese fishermen here. So they're stuck on these Taiwanese fishing vessels. But my research goes one step further and is able to contact a group of men who actually jumped ship and ended up in the Caribbean. So where the story continues with my research is these vessels end up all over the world. At one point, they end up in Trinidad and Tobago, which is the most southern Caribbean island. And these captains allowed these Vietnamese migrants to leave their ships to stretch their legs, but they kept their paperwork, specifically their passports, once they left the ships. So some of these men saw this as their opportunity. So they absconded onto the shores of Trinidad and began a new life there. So Trinidad, for those who don't know, has a large Chinese population. So these Vietnamese migrants worked in Trinidad under the guise of Chinese migrants. So over time, these Vietnamese migrants, they earn a steady income. They have safer working conditions in Trinidad. They climb the economic ladder. And then they start telling their friends to jump ship. So what happens is you start seeing the formation of chain migration from Vietnam, Taiwan, and then ultimately to Trinidad.
Both absolutely fascinating cases. Andrew left us with a real good cliffhanger, right? He was like, he set up the story, said it was the end, but really it's the beginning as well, which is great. What I like about podcasts, as opposed to reading a paper, is that you actually get to speak with the people who wrote the research or co-wrote the research, as is often the case, and you get to actually hear a little bit about the people. From a personal point of view, very often I think that if you're not working in academia, that a text can appear as this very sort of distanced or even abstract thing. And of course, those of us who do work in academia or at the side of academia, we know there are people behind the research. And so it's always good, I think, to learn a little bit about the people doing the research as well. So I'm wondering, could you just give us a little bit of background about how you ended up researching what you researched? Because for someone who's not in academia, they might be like, that's a really specific thing to research. How did you end up researching, labor migration and fish, right? So how did you end up here? And then I guess as a follow-up question, which is still related, is then once you're there, how do you end up doing that research? Once you get an interest in a topic, how do you go about doing it? Let's go to India first again.
So interestingly, I have a very long connection with the sea. I used to be a seafarer for about 15 years of my adult life. From 18 onwards, I was at sea. And then I left that to do work with fishing unions and small-scale fish worker unions in India. And for a while, I just remained bound on land, working with people who, went out in the mornings, came back in the evening for a few hours. And then COVID really was the turning point of that. And also for my PhD, because it was around 2019-20 that I met a group of people who were getting interested in migration. And then COVID hit, and we had to form this network to respond to the crisis. For listeners who are not familiar, in India, there was a COVID lockdown that was announced within 4 hours. So at 8 p.m., the Prime Minister came on, announced all borders to be closed. And by midnight that night, there was police everywhere and borders were closed. And obviously then fishing was one of those occupations where the boats kept coming back from sea for the next 7, 8, 10 days. And usually they're not meant to be in the harbor together. And so we ended up seeing thousands of workers stranded, deaths, wages not being paid, desertion meaning abandoned on the harbors by their boat owners. And that's where I started this work and this paper. I've arrived at academia from engaging with the response mechanism then, which was what do we do about a situation where people need to get home? And the papers really come out of a reflection of that. But it has shaped what I do now, which is as a PhD student, I look at business strategies in the seafood industry in India. And really, this paper was one of the ways to think about it because it revealed a very direct waged relation. And when you have communities and traditions kind of involved, it's really hard to see that there's a clear capital owner and then there's a worker because it's tied to relations of community and kin. And so this being people from a very different geography really opened up that binary. And it allowed us to go in and say, there is capital that is very clearly in the seafood business for profiting. It's not necessarily people from a traditional background. And that then opens you up to thinking about the sea and in fisheries in a lot of contexts that Andrew's work looks at, which is there are borders in the sea, even within national waters. There are boats competing with each other for the same fish. And then there are workers who get squeezed and their labor gets extracted to be able to bring those fish back for the markets. And so I think the relief work led to a reflection on Adivasi migration, which then led to a reflection on the PhD and informs it directly.
Thank you. And just as a reminder for the listeners, Adivasi means the indigenous populations of India, who are often sometimes referred to as tribal communities, but not so much anymore. But yes, so the indigenous communities, or tribal as sometimes they're incorrectly referred to, but people might have heard that. Andrew, what about yourself? Did you spend 15 years at sea?
I did not. That's so fascinating. I wish we can devote more time to learning about your experiences at sea. So my journey with my research, the ideas of migration have always been really personal for me. So my family and I arrived to the US as refugees from Vietnam. And that's always made me sympathetic to the stories and plight of migrants. If you ever looked at my research, that research agenda resonates throughout all of the projects I work on. But the connection with fishing work didn't begin until 2008. So I studied abroad in Trinidad and Tobago as a undergraduate student. And just very fortunately, I stumbled upon a group of Vietnamese migrants who were contracted to work on a house right across the street from where I was living at the time. I thought they were Chinese and I'd always, say hi to them. But then it wasn't until one night where I heard them actually singing a very traditional Vietnamese song. And then I was like, oh my God, you're Vietnamese too. And so that started this almost 2-decade journey to make sense of their experiences in Trinidad, how they got there, and just connecting it with their experiences at different locales. So I spent, a long time trying to connect their personal stories to these broader social forces. So I spent 2 summers in Taiwan to explore the experiences of migrant fishermen there. And then as a migration scholar, it's always impressed upon me that if you study migration, you have to understand what's happening in the receiving country, but also the sending country. So homeland and hostland is equally important. So with that in mind, I spent 18 months in Vietnam, a lot of time with men who migrated abroad as fishermen in one point in their life. And, this was a piecemeal approach to research, partly due to the limitations of funding as a graduate student. But I think the piecemeal approach allowed me to create this overarching narrative through following these migrants around. And it also allowed for more access and ease to my research sites. So, for instance, I found that with each experience, it made for the subsequent interviews and observations to be easier. So, in general, I think there's a wariness of any community to speak to outsiders. It's hard to get access. If they do talk to you, sometimes the answers can be very revealed. It's hard to get these real, raw answers. But being able to visit these different locales, I was able to kind of build up this capital, kind of this understanding of their plight, kind of showing them photos of places that I've been that connect to their experiences, calls with gatekeepers from other sites I've been part of. And I think that allowed for just more ease and more immersion and getting these fishermen to be candid with me. And that all began in 2008 when I was in Trinidad.
Wow, it's another amazingly rich story. I live in Budapest, and whenever I see groups of British people, I always avoid them because usually they're on stag parties, like dressed in like mankinis. But maybe I should interact once. It might lead me on a path of a multi-decade research project. I shouldn't just run away from my countrymen when I hear them, or sometimes smell them from a distance across the city. I think what's like super interesting in both your cases is you really bring this very strong personal connection into your research. It's not just research for research's sake, right? Because there's plenty of research that's produced in academia where it's produced and we can tell, to fill another line on a CV or to help with somebody's small intellectual quandary, which is fine. But also, it's also nice when you come across papers where there's an interaction or engagement with some of these bigger questions, like how can we think about improving working conditions at sea? What does this sort of research tell us about the problems and the issues with global capitalism and ways in which it can possibly or not be undermined, and how labour migration is also transforming or not transforming to certain degrees both host and sending societies. So that's a very sort of big sort of picture thing, but I think it's a important thing to attack or to engage with in this final part of the podcast. And I think we can be a bit more freewheeling here and jump in with one another, and we try to sort of raise the conversation a little bit in terms of its abstraction. So who wants to address this first?
I mean, when Andrew was talking about receiving states and sending states, he's looking at it, you're looking at it through the migration lens, and, that story of your connection and being candid with workers and, having years of relationship. I think that's really deep in the detail, and that, of course, comes across in your work. And we used social reproduction because the paper was written for a special issue on agrarian change and social reproduction.
I'm just going to jump in here and maybe say one word about social reproduction in case not everyone is familiar with the term. It's actually an old Marxist term, but it's used outside of Marxist theory a lot today, and it basically refers to the way in which society, reproduces itself, the way that the social structures persist from one generation to another, and also in terms of how it, of course, can change. And this very often refers to the passing on of material goods, including land. Also, in aristocratic societies, the passing on of titles, but also the use of education and the giving of education to one's children, and so on. So I'll let you jump back into the conversation. I thought it might be useful just to add that quick note.
Again, it's the home regions and what's happening there and paying attention to that. So I'm just going to briefly talk about that, but I'd love to then hear from Andrew as well about, what is it in the migration literature about, or how does that kind of help us with home and receiving states? Within India, the migration that we are looking at, it's indigenous people, largely with a lot of land, and a lot of land compared to agrarian holdings in India from the agrarian belts where, homesteads are less than a hectare, often small and marginal in size. But the indigenous people in forested and non-forested areas and the hills and the plains, generally in our interviews, had more land than that. What they didn't have was cash. And it kind of pointed to the need for hard cash to be able to sustain education, health, building a house, renting agricultural equipment, with climate change making farming harder, being able to take loans, the transformation of seeds. And so it showed this gradual process of agrarian change happening as well, which was aided, of course, by the retrieval of the state with liberalization. On the other side, it showed them getting absorbed into an occupation in fishing where the state is very active. It's giving subsidies, it's creating new regulations, it's investing in science, and it's assisting with capital to go out and exploit the sea. And so what we try to do is not only is it coming into Goa as the receiving state, but then also looking at the sea, which is what happens at sea. So we try and look at the ecology of the fishery with capital's kind of interest in the fishery. And it helped us answer some questions, which was, why only this kind of boat? So they don't work in all sectors. And so it brings up questions which I think are still unexplored about skill, about how skill is valued or devalued, about whose skill is required where, which kind of skills does capital call as skill and important, and then which ones does it discard as just being labor. And so what we also realized in the research then was that just like race structures a lot of international migration and work in fishing, caste and the caste system structures working conditions of indigenous workers, where the boat in itself represents a hierarchical system with the boat owners on the top, the more skilled traditional crew in the middle hierarchies, and then the indigenous people are not even referred to as fishers. They're just known as workers who pull nets. And so it revealed also these processes of society that then meet the sea. And on the last point, I think the intervention from the paper was also to try and intervene on the question of who makes the ocean productive, because there is a lot of literature in academia of the sea being an open space, a flat space, a space of openness and expanse, but often the labor is forgotten in that. And so it was a very central question to reinsert the question of the body of who works at sea. So those are some of the reflections on so what. In terms of policy and where we respond, I'll speak after Andrew if there's a moment to talk about that. But over to you, Andrew. I'd be really interested to hear about your thoughts on migration.
Yes, you're very interesting points that you bring up. So I'm just curious about your research. Just a point that you brought up is thinking about this migration. So working on these smaller boats to these bigger boats. And then you bring up this great point about the valuation of skill and how skilled might be differentiated through the eyes of the captains, but also in the eyes of kind of different size boats. I'm curious with your research when you were looking into this idea of skill. Was that a point of conversation with these fishermen? Was it a point of conversation with these captains about why do we take specific migrants from a specific region versus another one? I'm just curious, how does that role of skill play into your story that you're weaving?
Thanks, Andrew. A part of my other research, just in comparison, works with industrial trawlers. And trawling, in that sense, is three-dimensional. It's targeting a species that one can't see. And therefore, there is a sense that people who are from the sea understand the sea and can use traditional knowledge to kind of read the bottom of the sea that fish finders or echo sounders cannot. And so there is a clear evaluation of the people who come in there as being skilled because of the fishing skills that they carry. When it comes to the purse seine boats, which is the boats that just target the surface fish, we found that the boat owners as well as the captains kind of looked at themselves as being the skilled people because they could find the fish on the surface. But there was no skill needed beyond that. All that was needed was physical labor. And so there was two things happening. One was this constant differentiation of us versus them, that we find the fish, we use our tradition to find it, and we've been trained. and they cannot, they're just workers. And on the other hand, even when workers return to work in the fishery from the indigenous community, they were actively stopped from learning those skills. So we were told by workers that they're not allowed to climb up on the masts to scope for fish, or they won't be allowed into the engine room, even though some of the young people have technical degrees of working with diesel engines. And so there is an active differentiation that's created there as well, where opportunities are denied. And of course, then this plays out in the way the boat is organized and wages are shared and who's put at more risk. And so it was really in the attitudes of the captains, of the higher crew, but in narrations from the workers themselves, in how this difference plays out. And it's also created and actively kind of enforced with us versus them differentiations being made. And I would imagine that in your case, this plays out similarly on the boats as well, where traditional Taiwanese captains would kind of look at migrant crews as not being traditional enough to be at the same level as them.
Yeah, absolutely. Your points are really well taken, and it connects with my study and just my thinking of my own research. So the idea about skill is interesting, right? So skill we think about as this type of technical expertise, which is true. But the other side of skill is something I think that isn't really captured too much by social scientists. So, for instance, in my research, these Taiwanese captains make it a point to hire Vietnamese fishermen from a very specific part of Vietnam, the north central coast region. Now, this region has, a tradition of seafaring, but this region also has the largest numbers of deserters, so runaway migrants. And this issue has been going on in Vietnam since the 90s in terms of people breaking their work contracts and doing different types of labor. So the men in Trinidad are just under this umbrella of this runaway migrant phenomenon. Now, the question is in the research, why do these Taiwanese captains always return back to these migrant fishermen? If running away or desertion is such a huge problem, why not recruit somewhere else? Well, a plausible explanation is just once migration starts, it's hard to stop from a specific region to region. But I think from my narratives and my conversations with these captains, it's also because these men possess skill, right? And part of it is just being able to work proficiently on these ships, to be deft, to be nimble, to work on these ships. But also, another part of it, equally important, is thinking about the skill of persevering, the skill of trudging through, 2 to 5 years at sea where they won't be on land for much of that time. And I think that skill really attracts these Taiwanese captains in their recruitment of Vietnamese workers. And so I think that brings me up, and it segues to my thinking about this so what question. A huge question, right? It's important for all researchers, and the implications of our research is so important to meditate on. How do we connect what we find in our specific sites with a broader audience? Now, I have a couple of thoughts. The first one being the importance of highlighting migrants' agency and their autonomy in impacting change. So it connects to my firm belief that as social scientists, we cannot study a social phenomenon without making a concerted effort to understand the perspective and experiences of the social actors. So in my research, I focus on the experiences and the perspective of these social actors. And what my study shows is how these small acts of resistance from these migrant fishermen, so men jumping ship, absconding onto the shores of Trinidad and Tobago, how they can have larger structural changes, how they can trigger these large macro changes through their small acts of desertion. For example, because of these high desertion rates, the Taiwanese government has implemented several migrant labor policies to counteract this runaway migrant phenomenon. So, a lot of these acts are trying to free up these migrants, giving them autonomy to transfer to different ships, different workplaces if the ones that they work in are too abusive. And very much that example shows that, these small acts of desertion do have larger societal effects. Another example is in Vietnam at this time. The Vietnamese government has recently implemented Law 69. Law 69 is the law in which they're trying to stamp out opportunistic migrant brokers. So making sure that these migrant fishermen, are not affected by debt bondage and that they're able to freely change jobs or return home if the jobs don't live up to their advertisement.
Oh, me again, I'm going to jump in just on that word of debt bondage in case people aren't 100% sure about what that means. And that is basically when you owe somebody some money and you work to pay that off. And it's often the case in the world of work that sometimes people owe middlemen money and need to pay off their work that way. Or maybe they owe money for what's called training in a certain situation as well that they need to pay off before they are able to get paid. So there's many different forms debt bondage can take, but it's basically in a working relation in which one has to work for free for a certain amount of time until the debt has been paid.
You picked up a really important point, Andrew, on agency and, this example that you've shown. I mean, of course, we had the 2014-15 scandals, and I think most of the listeners are also informed, like many of the people, about Taiwan's fisheries and the level of exploitation there. But very often what's got lost in the narrative is what workers have themselves done, both actively, but also in these micro ways of, under the surface desertions that you're talking about. And just to connect that to what's happening in India, I mean, paying attention to agency has revealed a few things. One is that while there is a lot of migration, the advantage of migrating from a particular region where these workers come from is that it's not the mining area. So central India, where indigenous communities live, are heavily mined belts because of a lot of natural resources under the forest regions, but also are conservation areas and tiger reserves. But the particular districts where the people come from are not mined areas. And so with agrarian decline, most of the workers are 14, 15 years old and migrating for the first time. And fishing is 10 months of backbreaking work, but at the same time, it's also 10 months of work, which is scarce and rarely available in a lot of other seasonal work, where harvesting can be a month's work or work in agricultural fields can be 3 to 4 months a year. So there's definitely decisions that people make, which then involves taking care of kids, of older parents, of other community members coming in and balancing that with farming, sowing and harvesting. And so there's definitely home regions very actively at a community level, figuring out who migrates where and for what purposes. And the other thing is that people also move on. So when we went back after COVID to do some follow-up research for the paper, we found that most of the workers are no longer in Goa and they've acquired the skills and they've moved to the southern state of Karnataka where wages are higher. People work on catch share arrangements where they get a percentage of the fish that has been caught as opposed to wages, where they face a more equal kind of working environment. And they made this choice to move on. So now they treat Goa as a stepping stone to better work. Of course, it results in people continuously coming to Goa who are at sea for the first time with exploitative conditions. But it also shows that workers will move on and are moving on. So I think that point that you make on paying attention to agency and what workers do is really, really important. because it allows us to then take the research into a realm of responding to what workers are already thinking about, as opposed to, of course, prescribed kind of external inputs into some of these issues.
I love your point. This like small observation, but this idea that these men start at 14 or 15, and there's this seemingly this kind of mobility ladder where they work in one region, and then perhaps over time they accumulate enough capital or experience, and they work in a different region. I'm just curious, thinking about your research, is thinking about migration pathways or migration trajectories, and how your specific migration stream, how it fits into this broader continuum. So, for instance, when I think about my work, my broader project is on these different migratory pathways that are available to Vietnamese aspiring migrants. And offshore fishing work is quite low on the totem pole. If we think about migration as stepping stones for the most desirable country, a lot of migrants that I talk with, the Western Europe, Australia, the US is this dream destination country. In that sense, you have offshore fishing as just the first step. One, because the fees, the brokerage fees are quite low. Two is because the requirements are also low too. But these migrants, they're not as young as 14 and 15. In Vietnam, they have to be older than 18 to be able to enlist and work abroad. But a lot of these men start out 18, 19, 20. They work on these migrant fishing vessels, and they end up trying to scale the ladder. So I'm curious, thinking about your research and fitting it into this broader context of Indian internal migration or even external migration. Where does your case study fall into these broader social patterns?
I think in this conversation and also in your case studies, what I'm really drawing upon is the need to pay more attention to migration. I mean, it's not something that I have worked on as a lens to look at this case study, but I think it offers so much to deepen and to strengthen the work of migrant fish workers that one is looking at. At the same time, I think the political economy of Indian fisheries, without going too much into the history and the details, because we're also short on time, I would imagine, is that, the horizon for Southeast Asian fish workers is much longer and wider than for a lot of the fish workers coming to India, because India just does not have an international fishery. And part of that is kind of tied to the labor movement, to the fish workers movement, where foreign boats coming into the Indian EEZ has been stalled. The expansion of Indian boats to the outside EEZ has been contained to some degree. I would imagine that in the coming years, as the boats get bigger and move out, we would see maybe offshore fisheries as just being the stepping stone to getting to more industrial fisheries. But at the moment, it seems to be, surprisingly, where most fisheries work is shown to be most exploitative. In India, work on these boats happens to be one of the higher end of the remuneration that indigenous people can seek in an annual basis. And on the last point, it also was expressed by many people that the sea is a space of liberation and freedom for them, which also kind of highlights the social conditions of caste that can be so violent and so oppressive on people that the ability to just escape with the boat captain for 14 days for most of the year can seem as a better option, and therefore that's a route that is preferred out of other occupations.
So there is a certain amount of agency afforded to guests on a podcast, but at some point that also ends. And so I did enjoy lying back and listening to you two discuss one another's work. I think it was really fascinating to me, and I hope also to the listeners, because you could ask the sort of questions that I couldn't, bringing your own expertise to discuss the two different cases. But our podcast is over. So the ultimate agency does lie with the person who has the stop button. So I'd like to thank you both for coming on Fishy Work. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Andrew. It has been interesting speaking and engaging with your work. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Let's do it again soon.
All right, so now we've reached the end of the podcast. It's time for our traditional catch-up with Alin Kadvak, Fishy Work's Not in the Net. How do you enjoy that conversation between Siddharth and Andrew?
Very much. Thank you, Ian. It was such a wonderful to actually hear both of them, two academics who were very passionate about their work.
You're a great matchmaker.
Am I? Yeah, I know. I mean, you didn't work half of the podcast, didn't you?
No, I just lay back on my hammock and listen to those two guys really get excited about one another's work, which is hopefully what the listeners also got at home as well.
Exactly.
So, for you, my first question to you, as always, is what did we learn today?
I think a big theme that we just, share across both of their work is about migrations, right? So the migrations as a lens to try to understand fish worker is very important because in a way, most of the fish worker are migrants, and migrations, include not only the migrate between nations, but also migrate between regions and location. So that's one point that actually coming up from both of their work, and also the importance understanding about migrant agents and agency, right? So in a way, we should move away from the narrative that fish workers are passive, are the victims of the whole industry, because in a way they have agency, because they want to migrate to work to get a better life. So that's their migration trajectory, right? To be able to have a better salary, better income to send the money back. So we should think of them as a very active agents, and they try to do, like other work, have a better life.
And so why is it important?
Well, I think I will probably speak to the policymaker that, you cannot try to solve or understand the issue of labor rights in fisheries without trying to understand the migrations and migrations trajectories and migration pathway. That was the term that Andrew spoke about, in the way that best thing for a policymaker or those organizations that involved in this, it is important because, the migrant fish workers are migrating anyway, right? So the best way to do it is to the safe migration pathway, so they have a connection back to their family and supports.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much again. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you, and I'm looking forward to doing the same again on the next episode of Fishy Work. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, I didn't record it. I forgot to press record.
No. But it's red.
Fishy Work is part of the Just Seafood project, a collaboration between the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Sweden, the University of Ottawa in Canada, the Institute of Social Sciences of the Central Region, Vietnam, and the Cambodia Development Resource Institute in Cambodia. It's funded by the Swedish Research Council for Sustainable Development, FORMAS, and the Swedish Research Council, VR. The project's principal investigator is Dr. Alin Kadvak, and I've been your host, Ian M. Cook. If you would like to get in touch, and we really hope you do, then please go to justseafood.org. That is JUSTSEAFOOD.org. fishywork.org, and you can find all of our details there. And not only that, you can also find much more information and research relating to the topic, and you can also find full transcripts of the podcast episodes. Finally, everybody says it in podcast, and everybody says it because it's true, that please do leave ratings and reviews if you are so inclined, because it really does help more people find out about the show.